This exchange between Representative Gabe Vasquez and the Secretary of Defense is more than a back and forth about border security. It exposes a recurring tension in national policymaking, the gap between decisions made in Washington and the lived realities of people who actually reside in the regions affected by those decisions. Vasquez isn't simply challenging a budget choice, he's challenging whether the decision-makers truly understand the ground they're making decisions about.
Funded through reconciliation.
Secretary, are you familiar with the Animas Mountains, with Alamo Hueco, with San Luis Mountains, with Guadalupe Pass or Long Canyon?
Again,
Critical border areas.
I'm aware that there are gaps in different places where walls are not as effective as other places, and I get that.
Thank
We're
you,
applying
Secretary.
infrastructure
I appreciate your answer
where it
on that.
makes the most sense because
Thank
we're
you.
going to get 100% operational
Thank you,
control of the border.
Secretary. So you agree then that a border wall doesn't make sense for the entire country?
I think we need a border wall across our entire border.
Okay, so you should know then why it's almost physically impossible to build a border across the Animas Mountains and the terrain challenges that that poses and the billions of dollars. Do you know if there's roads on those mountains currently?
If we're going to spend money as a government,
Okay.
it should be
I'll take that as a no.
secure our southern
Well,
border.
the point I'm trying to make, Secretary, is that if this is so important to the military, and you as Secretary of the Department of Defense should know more about the border. Mr. Secretary, I urge you to skip the photo ops next time that you go to a port of entry and spend time on the ground in places like Diamond A Ranch.
I think you should ask the soldiers on the border whether they've been photo op visits or not, because I spent a lot of
Secretary-
time on the ground
Secretary,
with
are
the
you-
soldiers, getting an understanding of what
Secretary,
they're
I'm
facing,
gonna
what
ask
they're
you a
doing,
question
what
that-
their capabilities
Secretary,
are.
I reclaim
not
my
for a
time.
photo op.
Thank you.
As the
Secretary, I
Secretary of
reclaim my
Defense to
time.
understand what our
Chairman,
troops
may I
do
reclaim
and
my
why.
time?
Gentleman
they
reclaims
do it.
his time.
Thank you. Secretary, do you know what a tethered aerostat system is?
I do.
Okay. Well, great. Then you know that this type of surveillance technology is superior to having thousands of troops sitting in trucks looking at an empty desert. I've requested funds for more tethered aerostat systems. We haven't had a response from your department. Are you familiar with ASTs?
What's an AST?
Well, it's an autonomous surveillance tower. They're equipped with these advanced cameras that have the capability to relay critical information to border agents on the ground. And this type of technology is badly needed on the boot heel. And it's a much better expenditure than a border wall is.
I've seen that. I've seen those towers in use.
Great. Well, these technologies have been described to me by both Border Patrol and CBP as force multipliers, allowing their personnel to focus on law enforcement efforts while leaving this mundane surveillance task to much more efficient and cost-effective technology, a much more efficient way to surveil that part of the border. Now, Mr. Secretary, I have serious concerns with your fundamental lack of knowledge about the U.S.-Mexico border, considering the billions of dollars that DOD is slated to spend on this mission, with little clarity to those of us who live there. I would encourage you to do some homework on my region and learn what will actually make our border more secure and more safe. Mr. Secretary, I understand that the border is a top priority for you and the Department of Defense. Well, it's also one of my top priorities in my border district. That's why I've introduced bipartisan legislation to stop fentanyl at the border, secure our ports of entry, hire more CBP personnel, and combat the cartels, areas that I'm sure we agree on. Now, DOD has spent more than $525 million from the defense budget on military operations on the border. You've done it by diverting over $1 billion from military modernization and quality of life programs like housing. And as such, I'm sure you're well informed as to what your warfighters are doing on our border and the characteristics of the border itself. Secretary Hegseth, do you know how many border miles there are in New Mexico?
Not the exact number of
Can you
miles.
give me a round figure?
Hundreds.
Okay, 180 miles. Can you tell me where the border wall starts and ends on this map of New Mexico?
I'm not properly oriented to your map, but I know that unfortunately, because of the administration previous, they did not have the opportunity to finish the border wall.
Thank you,
let it rust
Secretary.
on the ground instead of
Thank you,
putting it up,
Secretary. And you have been
defending
to
our
New
border.
Mexico. Could you tell me where in New Mexico you've been to?
I've been to the border twice to look at once at our national defense area down there because I can't recall a time when a Secretary of Defense has gone down in the first 4 or 5 months of his tenure to the border to better understand.
Was that in
the
an urban
situation
area
there.
or in a rural area?
Both areas, traversed rural areas and urban.
Okay,
areas.
so you must be
some
familiar-
with walls, some without.
Secretary,
If President Trump was actually supported, we'd have a
Thank
border
you, Secretary. I reclaim my time. So the most remote part of New Mexico is called the Boot Heel. And I'm not sure that you spent any time in the Boot Heel of New Mexico. Mr. Secretary, I was raised on the border. I've lived there my whole life. I've worked alongside ranchers, farmers, landowners, wildlife biologists, and other stakeholders for over a decade. I headed a border security task force in my district before coming to Congress. I've traveled with Border Patrol on ATVs. I've hunted the border on horseback and hiked dozens of miles in the most remote stretches of the border in this region. Now, do you happen to know why there hasn't been a border wall built in the Boot Heel?
Well, based on what you just described, you should be a big fan of what our administration is
Well,
undertaking.
Secretary, I'm asking why a border wall has not been built. Funds have been allocated for other parts of the border. but
Here's
not
what I know.
here.
Our commanders on the ground and others and our engineers would understand what goes where and why, and where there should be a border wall, there will be a border wall.
Okay.
When Vasquez presses the secretary on basic facts, border mileage, wall placement, regional terrain, it's not to score rhetorical points. It's to highlight something deeper, a belief that national security strategy must be shaped from the ground up, informed by geography, local experience, and on-the-ground realities that cannot be fully captured in briefings or political narratives. Knowing how many miles of border New Mexico has may seem trivial, but to someone who has lived, worked, and patrolled that border his entire life, it's symbolic of something larger: credibility. Vasquez emphasizes his upbringing and experience, raised on the border, working with ranchers, farmers, wildlife biologists, border agents. This establishes an important contrast. For people who live in the region, the border isn't an abstract policy battleground, it's everyday life. It shapes community safety, land use, migration patterns, environmental challenges, and the relationship between locals and federal agencies. When he talks about traveling on horseback, riding ATVs with Border Patrol, or navigating remote mountain passes, he's not embellishing. He's illustrating how complex and rugged this terrain truly is. This matters because proposals like building a continuous border wall often rely on oversimplified maps and political messaging that ignore geological and logistical reality. The Boot Heel region, which Vasquez focuses on, is one of the most remote, ecologically sensitive, and geographically challenging segments of the U.S.-Mexico border. It contains steep mountains, canyons, wildlife corridors, and terrain that would require blasting, road construction, and massive environmental disruption just to begin erecting a physical barrier. This isn't theoretical, it's engineering fact. The exchange also highlights another key issue: cost-effectiveness. Vasquez emphasizes newer surveillance technologies, tethered aerostats, autonomous towers, sensor networks, and identifies them as force multipliers. These tools allow agents to cover vast, remote areas without physically placing personnel in dangerous or inefficient positions. From a security standpoint, that means earlier detection, better situational awareness, and fewer resources spent on static manpower. From a fiscal standpoint, it often means better outcomes at lower long-term cost. His frustration becomes most evident when he calls on the secretary to skip the photo ops. That line cuts to the heart of the matter. For border communities, border security isn't about symbolic visits or high-profile appearances at ports of entry. It's about policies that actually reflect the lived experience of the people dealing with this terrain daily. When leadership visits only the most visible or accessible locations, it can create the illusion of understanding without genuine engagement. At its core, this exchange reveals a deeper problem facing federal agencies. When missions expand rapidly, like the Department of Defense's increasing involvement at the border, there is pressure to allocate resources quickly, often without deep consultation with the communities or experts who know the terrain best. Vasquez's repeated questions about terrain, technology, and feasibility underscore the need for policy that is built on practical knowledge rather than assumptions. The broader significance isn't about who won the exchange. It's about recognizing how essential it is for national security decisions to be informed by those who understand the landscape, not just politically, but physically. Border regions are not monolithic. Some areas are urban, some are desert, some are densely populated, some are nearly impossible to traverse. Effective policy must reflect that diversity. For viewers, the takeaway is this: nuance matters. Border security is not a single solution or a single structure. It's a network of strategies: geography, technology, human expertise, land management, and international cooperation. Understanding how each region differs helps us understand why debates like this one are so important.